It functions as a plunger.
But what was the universe?
A little bit naive.
Certain sort of magic.
Mate, what have you got against Mark?
Let's zip together.
You're not in charge, Commies.
Hello, Tom Tilley with you for what's been a huge day in federal politics. A man has died at the Manus Island Detention Centre. 1,000 more people have lost their jobs in manufacturing. And the court says this guy is a liar.
Well, I think actually there's a lot of people in your jobs who will end up being the Lance Armstrongs of journalism.
Ah, yes. Former member for Doe Bell, Craig Thompson, has been found guilty of spending union money on sex. We'll talk through all of those stories on the show today with Coalition MP Kelly O'Dwyer, who's the member for Higgins in Melbourne, and the Greens Senator Scott Ludlam from WA. Welcome to the show, guys.
Great to be with you, Tom.
Good afternoon.
Scott, I'll go to you first because after the September election, it looked like you'd actually lost your Senate seat. You appealed that decision, and then we found out that the Australian Electoral Commission had lost over 1,300 votes. Now, today, the High Court has come out and all but confirming that the vote will be held again. Is that your reading of it, Scott? Because it wasn't exactly clear.
No, it wasn't completely clear. It's a two-stage process, so we don't have a declaration that we're absolutely going back to the polls yet. So obviously we can't say when that's going to happen. But the general legal view coming out of it is that we're pretty much lined up, and that's what looks like is going to happen. So we've got to wait another 2 days, and then I think that's where we're headed.
And how soon will they have to hold the election if they are going that direction?
Well, to be honest, it's got to be held well before the 1st of July because that's when new senators will have to take their seats. So my inclination is that it should really happen during the autumn recess when Parliament's not sitting, but that's up to the Governor of Western Australia. It's completely out of our hands. All
right, we'll wait and see how that one pans out. Let's go to the big story of the day, the tragedy in Manus Island that happened overnight. One asylum seeker's dead. Another one was shot in the buttocks, and there were 77 injuries. Now, that's what we do know about what happened last night on Manus Island, but there's lots we don't know, including how many asylum seekers are still on the loose. Refugee advocates are calling for the government to close all of our offshore detention facilities, but as Alice Workman reports from Canberra, the government's planning on doing the exact opposite.
Asylum seekers on Manus Island have been protesting for weeks. But on Sunday night, things started escalating.
A riot squad was mobilised yesterday afternoon.
There are reports that fires have been lit as well as fences torn down.
Then around 11 p.m. last night, asylum seekers broke through the external fence of the Manus Island Detention Centre. What happened next? We aren't exactly sure, but there were horrific results.
It is my great regret to report there were 77 persons who received treatment since early this morning. There were 13 serious injuries. There was one critical injury, and there is one person who is deceased. The critical injury involves a probable basal skull fracture. There is a serious injury to one transferee, which involves a gunshot wound to the buttock.
That was Immigration Minister Scott Morrison in Darwin this morning. He's yet to give any detail as to exactly what happened, how someone died, and who shot one asylum seeker. But he did say that the asylum seekers put themselves at risk by going outside the perimeter of the centre fence.
This is a tragedy, but this was a very dangerous situation where people decided to protest in a very violent way and to take themselves outside the centre and place themselves at great risk.
Ian Riddle is from the Refugee Action Coalition. He says asylum seekers were injured when locals and Papua New Guinea police entered the centre.
From what we heard, that there were gangs of armed police and locals actually went from compound to compound, hunting down asylum seekers and inflicting, very serious injuries on people that they got their hands on.
He says staff and asylum seekers saw PNG police and locals with sticks, machetes and guns.
There were reports that there were gunshots could be heard there, and certainly there have been earlier reports that police were openly carrying weapons and that there were some weapons amongst the locals. People have been attacked with sticks and machetes. People have been chopped with machetes, beaten with sticks.
The immigration ministers denied these allegations. Some reports say the unrest began when the detainees were told they wouldn't be settled on PNG. The minister says protests have been brewing at the centre for months and the situation could have been much worse.
Well, we put a large number of additional security people in place last week. And if that hadn't been done, then I think that the incident that we saw over the last 2 nights could have resulted in even more unfortunate result.
He says because of the additional security, the centre wasn't destroyed, and around 2 a.m. was operating as normal. But we're not sure whether all asylum seekers are accounted for. Shadow Immigration Minister Richard Marles says there needs to be an inquiry.
The proper, orderly running of the detention facility appears to be breaking down. We need to know exactly what's going on there. We need to have a full inquiry, and we need to know what the government is going to do to rectify the situation and stop this happening again.
David Mann is the Executive Director of the Refugee and Immigration Legal Centre. He says even if there is an inquiry, there's no guarantee the government will release it.
One of the things that we need to know as part of this is whether any of this was prompted or caused by the despair, the damage that we know leaving people in remote, indefinite incarceration does, and it's breaking people. And we've committed as a country under the Refugees Convention and other human rights treaties to not exposing people fleeing from harm to further harm. Instead, that's exactly what we're doing by sending people to those places. They should be closed down.
But the government plans to do the exact opposite. In September last year, Prime Minister Tony Abbott said he wanted to make tent cities by increasing the capacity on Manus Island by 1,230 places and Nauru by 2,000 places. He didn't give a rollout date, but it appears that process may already be in motion. In the last year, the population of Manus Island has jumped from 221 in January 2013 to 1,353 in January 2014. And the population of Nauru has more than doubled, from 415 in January last year to 1,012 in January this year. Hack's been told that on Friday the Department of Defence moved 7 trucks worth of equipment from an event hire company in Sydney to a warehouse near the port of Brisbane. Staff were told the equipment, which included marquees and fold-out beds, was being moved to prepare for quick deployment to Nauru and Manus Island, where it would be used to house a large number of people, asylum seekers. Hack tried to confirm this with the Immigration Department and the Department of Defence, but they didn't get back to us.
Alice Workman reporting, and the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison, has just given a press conference. It's actually still going. He's taking questions from journalists. Here's a little bit of what he had to say. He said that no more than 2 shots were fired. He said it was reportedly the PNG police, but they can't confirm who did it. Here's a bit of that press conference.
The incident escalated quickly with several hundred transferees involved. A number of transferees moved from the facility to the adjoining road where they'd also pushed down fences.
Scott Morrison giving more of the details, and he said that he will go to PNG soon, but he's awaiting advice on when it will be safe. I'd love to know what you think. A lot of people texting in already. Someone says, don't forget that Australia was found guilty by the international courts for our treatment of asylum seekers who were held indefinitely. The government's attitude towards refugees has to change. Another person says, this Manus Islands place is starting to sound like a concentration camp. People being locked up, assaulted and killed for no good reason. Well, I'd love to know what you think. Do you think this death and the rolling violence in Manus Island changes the way Australia should be handling its boat arrivals? Give me a call.
Call 1300 0555 36 or text 0439 75 7555.
To discuss these developments, we have Kelly O'Dwyer in the studio. She's a Coalition MP, and we have Green Senator Scott Ludlam. Now, Kelly, I'll start with you on this one. A true or false question, actually, to get started. Mm-hmm. Until significant numbers of asylum seekers on Manus Island are granted asylum, will we continue to see deadly pressure building inside this detention centre that we operate?
Well, no, I don't think that necessarily follows. Certainly there's a lot of heightened emotion, as you would expect, when people are concerned about their futures. And I think it's really tragic when we have heard about the incidents that we've heard about today and the tragic loss of life. But equally, it's also tragic when we hear about the loss of life when people make a dangerous journey over the sea in order to try and come here. And let's not forget that more than 1,000 people that we know about have lost their lives in making that journey. And in the last 60 days, there has not been an arrival by boat in Australia. Not one person has arrived by boat on that dangerous journey through the people smuggling network, whereas at the same time last year, over the last 60 days in the comparable time last year, we saw more than 1,300 people arrive in just that way.
But Kelly, yes, you make a good point that part of your policy is working about stopping new arrivals, but you've got over 2,000 people locked up in Nauru and Manus Islands, seriously concerned about their future, and no one's been processed yet at PNG, which is, the country where Manus Islands is. This is going to continue, isn't it? These people are going to be totally frustrated because they see no way out.
Well, we have to process each of their claims appropriately according to the criteria. We have to assess their claims, and that's the right, fair and proper thing to do. You can't always do that overnight. You have to do that properly.
But how long is it going to take?
Well, it takes as long as the process actually takes, Tom.
But you've been able to process refugees a lot quicker in the past, and you've had since September when this agreement was signed, and no one's been processed yet.
I'm very confident that we have appropriate people on the ground processing the claims according to the correct criteria, and I think that anybody in that position whose claim is being assessed would want it to be assessed in that proper and fair way.
All right, Scott Ludlam, Kelly O'Dwyer made an interesting point about the deaths at sea. There were over 1,000 deaths at sea, and now we're talking about a much smaller number of deaths of people that have died inside Australian-run detention facilities. Does she make a fair point?
No, it's a horrifying comparison. My question to Kelly, if I may, would be, do you think there was a way of preventing people from taking these risky voyages without torturing children and becoming a regional human rights abuser? Because that's what we are now. I cannot believe I just heard Kelly use the words right, fair and proper to describe what's going on Manus at the moment. This centre and others like it must close now.
Well, Scott, I think it's completely and utterly alarmist and wrong of you to suggest
alarmist. Somebody was shot dead overnight.
I'm happy to respond to the point that you make, to say that we are abusing children. That is simply not the case. When we were last in government, before there were changes to the policy, before it was dismantled by the Labor government, with the help of the Greens, there was not one child in detention, not one.
How many do you have in detention now, Kelly?
Well, I mean, we have only just got into government, and we don't want to see any child in detention. I mean, that is not the aim of this policy at all. We don't want to see children in detention.
That's
great. At the same time, Scott, you have to accept. I mean, if I can ask you a question, do you accept any responsibility whatsoever for putting incentives on the table for people smugglers and vulnerable people to make a journey over the seas that has resulted in more than 1,000 deaths?
Well, you've got the question completely wrong. There were no incentives put on the table because the Greens haven't had a chance to have our policy applied. And the one thing I will let you off the hook on is that Manus was opened by the Labor Party against the express opposition of the Greens. We believe that the best way to prevent people from taking these risky voyages without becoming a regional human rights abuser and trying to become more scary than the Taliban is a safe pathway. That's how you disrupt the people smugglers'
Scott,
business
you're all
model.
care and no responsibility.
Pathway.
I mean, what is your policy?
You folk did slogans very effectively for several years, but now you're in government, and I wish you would start behaving like it.
I'll just jump in there, guys. That's an interesting point, Kelly O'Dwyer. I mean, stopping the boats by making the conditions so tough is one thing, but how do you deal with this other side of the situation where you're responsible for these detention centres where people now are being killed?
Well, we of course take our responsibilities very seriously. The majority of people, as I understand it from the information presented by the Minister, the majority of people at the facility were not involved in these violent protests. It was a select number of people who were involved in these violent protests, and it was very clear that first and foremost, the people in charge of the facility on the ground there wanted to preserve the safety of the other people who were in that centre having their claims processed. So we were able to preserve their safety. That is exactly what we should be doing and making sure that we are doing. And unfortunately, if people are committed to violent acts, we have to put in place appropriate measures in order to prevent them from participating in those violent acts.
All right, a lot of people texting in. One person says, I love the language. We no longer call them detainees, but now transferees are political nuances. That's Steph in Miranda. Another person says these centres aren't new. If these aren't what the refugees want, then maybe migrate through the correct channels. And Jake's called in from Melbourne. Jake, you think it's good that asylum seekers are being held offshore, even when we see these kind of events?
I think that Kelly's right on the money, this government. If the people are not coming via boats because of the conditions, it's one that's not. It's not an incentive to come here, and you get in the gate for free.
So are you saying this kind of news that we're seeing, like this death, is good news because it will deter more people from coming?
It's not good news. Any death is not good news. But I'm just saying that it's a deterrent. So the people smugglers aren't being able to bring people here because people don't want to come here because of the conditions. But obviously the people are eventually going to get through the processes and they're going to weed out the good from the bad and they'll be brought into Australia. And then people will go the right avenues and not come across and risk their life. What's one death on the water? 1,000 deaths on the water for one death in detainee.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Thanks so much for the call, Jake. Ellie, what do you think?
I would just like to make the point that that the level of refugees that we get here in Australia is really minimal compared to countries like in the EU, for example. And I'm just wondering what they think about our international obligations in all of this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Ellie, and I'll put that to you, Kelly O'Dwyer. What do you make of that point, that relative to a number of other countries, particularly in Europe, where they take a lot of asylum seekers from Africa, that our intake is relatively low?
With the greatest respect to Ellie, I would actually point out the fact that we have one of the highest per capita intakes in the world. If we're not currently the highest, we're probably the second highest. And Canada generally are either the top one or two per capita who actually take in the most number of refugees. So I would have to respectfully say that that's not correct.
All right, you are listening to Triple J's Hack program as we dissect what's been a huge day in Australian politics.
Hack. This does look like a witch hunt. It smells like a witch hunt.
Triple J.
You are listening to Hack, and last year when I interviewed Craig Thomson, the disgraced former Labor MP, I asked him this question. If you have been lying, do you realise you'll be the Lance Armstrong of Australian politics?
Well, I think actually there's a lot of people in your jobs who will end up being the Lance Armstrongs of journalism, quite frankly, can I say. And I look forward to that day.
Well, that day never came. I can tell you that the court has settled that argument. Craig Thomson is the Lance Armstrong of Australian politics. He protested his innocence time and time again, and the Victorian Criminal Court has ruled today that he was lying. He's been found guilty of dishonestly using his union credit card to pay for prostitutes, and we'll wait to see what his sentence will be. Now, the federal government has announced a review into the Renewable Energy Target, which is a plan to generate 20% of electricity through renewables by 2020. And the man they've appointed to head the review says he's sceptical about human-induced global warming. As Sarah McVie reports, scrapping the target altogether hasn't been ruled out.
Our goal is very simple: to maintain investment certainty, to review the progress and to ensure we can take the pressure off electricity prices.
Environment Minister Greg Hunt wants to make your power bills cheaper. At the moment, the renewable energy target is costing the average household $102 a year.
We are a government that is unashamedly doing our best to take pressure off manufacturing and households through anything which can lower electricity prices.
But how does the renewable energy target work? Frank Yotzer from the Centre for Climate Economics and Policy at the ANU.
The target specifies an amount of renewables that is to come on board every year, and the market sets the price, or the price premium that generators are being paid in order to provide that renewable electricity. And it's been perfectly effective in that way.
The renewable energy target was introduced by John Howard in 2001 and ramped up to its current target of 20% by Labor in 2009. In 2012, the Climate Change Authority reviewed the policy and found the government should keep the target despite falling electricity demand and some electricity generators saying it would drive the cost of power up by billions. The Climate Change Authority is now being disbanded by the government. Frank Yotzer says falling energy demand is good for the environment but bad for traditional power companies.
We have households saving energy, really reacting to these increased electricity prices, and that in itself is driving down greenhouse gas emissions, which is a wonderful thing. But of course, it makes the situation for the established electricity generators more difficult because essentially the market is shrinking, the cake is shrinking that people are fighting over for their profits.
The Renewable Energy Target Review is to be headed up by the former Reserve Bank board member Dick Warburton, a man who lobbied on behalf of manufacturers against the carbon price.
What I am sceptical is the claims that man-made carbon dioxide is the major cause of global warming.
The review was always due this year, and Dick says he won't let his own views get in the way.
I will be treating this in a completely open mind.
We need to see it wound back in terms of its ambition, and gradually phased out would be desirable from the perspective of industry and energy users.
That's Birchall Wilson, Chief Economist at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He told 7:30 he welcomes Dick Warburton's appointment and says renewable energy providers should have to compete on an even playing field with traditional power suppliers.
The problem with the renewable energy target is it's a very inefficient way of abating carbon. There are low-cost alternatives available, and effectively we're undermining our emissions reduction effort by persisting with the renewable energy target.
Renewable energy target is working, and it should be left alone to do its job.
That's Kane Thornton from the Clean Energy Council. He says the scheme has driven investment in renewables.
There's now over $10 billion worth of investment in large-scale renewable energy projects based on the current scheme.
Sarah Hanson-Young says Tony Abbott wants the targets scrapped.
Now we have the Prime Minister doing everything he can to get rid of the RET. Thankfully, we still have the Greens in the Senate, and we'll be doing everything we can to stop the removal of the RET in the Parliament.
Frank Yotzer says it's likely the government will keep the scheme, but in a far reduced form.
The renewable energy target may well remain, but that the ambition may be taken out of it. You could very easily do that by just simply reducing the amount of renewable energy that's legislated to be brought on board through the renewable energy target. That in turn would reduce the price at which the renewable energy certificates are being traded at, and that in turn would reduce the incentive, the extra incentive that people have to invest in renewables. It could potentially reduce it all the way down to zero, so that there wouldn't be no additional support for renewables left.
You're listening to Hack on Triple J with Tom Tiller.
Frank Yotzer speaking to our reporter Sarah McVie. Someone has texted in saying, if we could only harness energy from stupidity, we'd be absolutely rich. I'd love to know what you think. Do you think households should be paying $100 extra on their electricity bill to support the renewable sector? Give me a call.
Call 1300 0555 36 or text 0439 75 7555.
As we riff on the big day in politics, we have Kelly O'Dwyer, Coalition MP, and Scott Ludlam, a Green Senator, with us. Kelly, to you, would you say that $100 a year is too much for households to pay in order to move Australia into a green energy future?
Well, certainly people feel the cost of their electricity bills, and for some people that's a huge amount of money, and every last dollar does count. But let me just say this, Tom. I mean, there is despite the Green Scare campaign on the fact that there's a review, this has been mandated in legislation that there would be a review in 2014, and we're simply getting on with the job of doing the review on the Mandatory Renewable Energy Target. I mean, we did actually bring in, as a coalition government, the Mandatory Renewable Energy Target. Our members such as me are really committed to renewable energy. I spoke about it in my maiden speech. So the idea that there is some, wonderful fear campaign that should come out of this really is more just about the Greens getting back on their soapbox.
Let's get into your point about the $100 being too much. Isn't the idea that if you invest in renewable energies, our power bills will go down in the future?
Well, I think that's part of the theory, but let's not forget.
Do you believe it? Do you think if we do invest in renewables that our bills will actually go down and these short-term, or medium-term investments will actually be worth it?
Well, currently, at the moment, the mandatory renewable energy target is around 20%, but it's effectively 27% because it's been reasonably effective. But it does come at a very significant cost, and that cost does get passed on to, ultimately, consumers. One of the other elements that's putting a huge impost on people's energy bills is, of course, the carbon tax. Now, we took that to the last election to say that we were going to scrap it. The Labor Party even promised that they too would scrap it. They've gone back on their word, and the Greens are now going to block it in the Senate.
All right, well,
let's go to wrong, and we'd like to be able to reduce people's energy bills by getting rid of the carbon tax.
Scott Ludlam, you're outraged about the carbon tax, but you're also outraged about this review into the renewable energy targets. Why is that?
Well, because it's a systematic pattern of behaviour. This is a Prime Minister who said that climate change was absolute crap. He's appointed a climate change denier to review a renewable energy target. So what this is, and let's be really clear,
it's not true. He's not a climate change denier, and it's just simply false to say that.
He appears to be misreading Year 9 science. We heard a quote from him earlier where he says he doesn't think that human-induced climate change is happening. So you've got to question the judgment right there. What's going on here, and I think people are actually fairly clear about this is an attack. It's an attempt to bankrupt the clean energy sector, not because it isn't working, but because it's working a little too well. It's driving wholesale prices down in South Australia where there's a lot of wind energy on the grid because, as I think you're kind of hinting at there, Tom, once you've put the capital in and built the plant, whether it's large-scale solar or wind or small-scale rooftop solar, once you've put it in, you've eliminated your future fuel costs. And that, of course, is what's so terrifying to the coal and gas generators, on whom Tony Abbott is now acting on their behalf.
But, Scott, I guess the question is, why do users have to pay for this? Why can't the big carbon emitters be paying for this? I mean,
that's a brilliant idea.
It's part of the plan with the carbon tax, but what's the point of having this as well?
Because we need to drive this transition as rapidly as possible. So what we've seen with the renewable energy target, and hats off, Prime Minister Howard introduced it. He didn't necessarily want to, but he did introduce a scheme that worked so well, it had to be increased before the deadline, which meant it was effective. But what it mainly built was low-cost wind. Now, what we need to do is catalyse investment in the next generation. So that's baseload solar thermal, wave energy plants, perhaps geothermal, the next generation of clean energy jobs. The best way to do that, ironically enough, is to tax the heaviest polluters in the country, make sure you protect people on low incomes, and transfer the rest of the money into the clean energy sector. And lo and behold, that's precisely the scheme that Kelly and her colleagues are trying to tear apart.
Kelly O'Dwyer, is it working too well? Is Scott Ludlam right?
Well, Scott does neglect to say that it does require a continual subsidy to these various different sectors in order to continue to produce the energy that they want to produce. So it is not correct to say that there is no ongoing cost to the Australian consumer that doesn't get passed on. And it does get passed on, of course, to every single taxpayer who ultimately has to pay the broader budget bill. So, now Scott, of course, wants to keep the carbon tax. He's very, very, very committed to it. The Australian people, I think, spoke with a very clear voice on that. They do want to get rid of it because they know how much it's adding to their energy costs and their electricity bills. I really wish that, he would actually listen to the mandate that we have been given as a government and simply get out of the way and allow us to pass the legislation that we promised that we would pass.
All right, I'm going to move on just quickly before we run out of time. Guys, there's been more bad news for Geelong today after car manufacturers Toyota and Ford officially pulled the plug. Aluminium company Alcoa today announced they'll permanently close their Point Henry smelter near Geelong, and they have about 480 employees there. And they'll also close the rolling mills at Geelong in New South Wales. That's 1,000 jobs all up, and more than half of them from Geelong. Kelly O'Dwyer, Treasurer Joe Hockey said that this is one of a number of businesses that will pass and many other businesses that will open. Is that a bit glib given we're talking about job losses on top of other job losses over the last few months?
I think, Tom, what you probably also neglected to say is that the Treasurer, of course, like every Australian, believes that it is very sad, of course, when somebody loses their job. It's got direct consequences for their family and for their local community. But what we need to do as a government is to be able to make sure that we support the jobs for the future, that we have the right framework in place so that business can invest, so that they can then employ more people, and so that people do have those jobs in place. And one of the ways that we actually go about doing that is by reducing the company tax rate, which is what we're going to be doing from the 1st of July next year. It's about also reducing energy costs, as I said, and the carbon tax. You know, we can't ignore it, but that has had a very serious impact, including on Alcoa, who said in 2011 that it was having a serious impact.
Well, they came out today
business.
and said it wasn't anything to do with their closure.
In 2011, though, they made some very strong statements that it
But
had...
would you believe what they say then or now?
Well, all
Because
I'm
we're talking about the
pointing
closure that was announced today.
Sure, but I'm simply pointing out the fact that there are often cumulative impacts that require
But if it was,
a business to make it...
they would have admitted that the carbon price is a problem today, but they said it wasn't.
Well, but
this flew in Joe Hockey's face, and is it flying in yours now?
No. I mean, they made the statements in 2011. Now, all I'm simply pointing out is
Sorry,
that...
Kelly, I know we're in the middle of an exchange here, but we're just about to run out of time, and I want to thank you for coming on the show.
No worries,
Scott
Tom. It's
Ludlam,
great to
you
be
as
with
well.
you and Scott.
Thank you so much for joining us. Linda Mariano's up after the news. We'll catch you later.